Thanks. So we appreciate you joining us for this two-part session. So first part, as you can see, is on the LOMA, or the Letter of Map Amendment, and then the second half will focus on the Letter of Map Revision based on fill. So these are probably the two most common letters of map change that you'll encounter. And so there are specific applications for these different letters of map change. So we have really three different forms. So the MTEZ is just for residential singular lomas, and then the MT1 form gets used for the LOMR-F, or if it's a LOMA for commercial properties or multiple properties, and if it's in the floodway as well. So people do have LOMAs in the floodway. Obviously, the mapping is incorrect in those locations, and so that form is used. And so these forms have not changed since 2014. That's when they expired, but they've just been kind of in the grace period until such time that new forms are released. And so I mentioned the MT2 form, and that would be for letters of map revision and not based on fill. Those are for your larger projects, and we'll get into that a little bit more. But for these two letters of map change, we have the MTEZ, which is a very simplified version of the form, and then the MT1 that is a little bit more detailed and complicated, since we are altering the landscape as far as for fill, or if it's more complicated, like I mentioned, a LOMA in the floodway. So you should be able to pull up these forms pretty directly online. Recently, FEMA has been very um, I guess things have changed quite a bit. Oops. I'm sorry. Keegan, the is this changing at all? Are you
Oh
still
yeah,
just
no,
seeing the
I'm
f
I'm just seeing the first slide still.
Okay, yeah, I think I may have shared the wrong screen. Let me fix that. I apologize. I have like three different screens, so I think I would just sharing the wrong one. Let me see. Hmm. No, it's you're seeing it, but it's not in presentation form. Is that what's happening?
Yes.
Okay. I don't know why it's not changing. Oh, how about now?
That's good.
Okay. Whoop. Okay, I'm sorry. You're seeing it now? Okay. Or it says which form to use.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Sorry about that. So yeah, this is just kind of a screenshot of those two different forms. Again, you should be able to find them pretty easily. And so if you look kind of at the center of the screen, you have the MT1. So any LOMA can be applied for on the MT1, and some surveyors prefer to just do it that way so they don't ever make a mistake, since the MTEZ can only be used in certain situations. But the MT1 can always be used. But like I said, MTEZ, just a single LOMA for a residential property. Anything else, probably just you need to use the MT1. So you can see the LOMA or the CLOMA. So that's conditional letter of map amendment. So basically, it's a proposal. And so FEMA signs off that if you construct as proposed, that it will be approved. And the same thing with the LOMR-F, you can get a conditional letter of map revision based on fill. And again, that's a parcel of land with a proposed structure that will be elevated on fill would not be inundated. So it would be at or above the base flood elevation, and that's the basic standard for getting approved for any of these letters, is that your lowest adjacent grade that's going to be touching the foundation is at or above the base flood elevation. And of course, in Kansas, we have our 1 foot above rule. So, um, FEMA just regulates to the bare minimum, but of course we have higher standards than that. So any new development would have to have the lowest floor at least 1 foot above the base flood elevation, and then some communities have adopted even higher than that. And so if you look towards the bottom of that form, it talks about the fill and if it was placed there already or when it will be placed. So that goes back to the conditional part of that, um, if it will be. Uh, yep. Uh-oh. Uh, I'm so sorry. Um, and so as I mentioned, these forms did expire in 2014 and they have not been updated since then. And so it would be good practice to just go back and check to make sure that there hasn't been an update. Because otherwise, if it were submitted, it probably wouldn't be approved if there were a new form. But I have not heard any news whatsoever about these getting updated. So it will probably be some time before that happens, but just in case you have it saved as a file, you might want to check that. And it's very much like the elevation certificate. Until a new form is released, then it's still considered to be acceptable and in a grace period until that happens. So that's why we just kind of recommend checking the website. And FEMA is just kind of all over the place right now with what they're updating or what they might take down or any new guidance. So it's very kind of chaotic right now, but that would be where the most recent up-to-date form would be located. And again, you can use these until further notice. So the MTEZ, again, it's a much lighter form of the MT1. Um, so again, it's only for a LOMA. That's a single property and it's residential. So they kind of have these checks as you go through the application. So the first question, has fill been placed on the property to raise the ground? And so it just tells you immediately, yes, stop and use the MT1 form. And then it just goes through basic information, the legal description for the property, um, and it should be matching the deed exactly. And then it goes into question 3. Are you requesting that a flood zone determination be completed for one, a structure on the property, and then the date of construction? So they want to compare the date of construction to the date of your mapping, because fill can be considered natural grade if it was put there before it was mapped. So that's why that's in place. And then if it's not a structure, then you can also do a portion of the illegally recorded property, but that would be the MT1. Um, and so um, that or a portion of the property, or you can do the entire legally recorded property. Um, and then at the bottom there, it says, yes, fill in place before the area is mapped can be considered natural grade. Okay. And then just basic contact information. Definitely do contact by email because it'll save a lot of time and if you're doing it through postal mail. So, especially if there's like back and forth on correcting information or providing missing information. I do have someone that I'm working with right now who does not interact with the internet whatsoever and are doing it by postal mail. So I don't know how long that's going to take. But it sounds like they just heard back from me. So it adds a lot of time, and I know very few people that would be doing that. So definitely provide your email contact information. So um, the structure, a natural grade, and as it says there, the lowest adjacent grade touching the structure that would include patios, stairs, deck supports, or garages. So anything that is structurally connected to that structure is considered um, in the determination for the LOMA. So anything wherever the deck supports are touching the actual natural grade, that would count towards the lowest adjacent grade that is considered and documented, or a legally recorded parcel of land or a portion of that property. And so there would be a meets and bounds description for that section of property. And then property description there, that information goes there. And then the street address, and then the type of construction, which is really critical since we're looking at lowest adjacent grade compared to the base flood elevation, what kind of foundation we're working with. So crawl space, slab on grade, and a basement. Um, and so about a basement, I think we have some slides on this later, but if it's a structure that's on natural grade, they might consider the intervening higher grade that's next to the window well. If that's high enough, they might approve the LOMA. And, sometimes it depends on who is reviewing your application. So that is a possibility, but it's definitely not with a LOMR-F, which again, we'll get into in the next hour. And then um, in decimal degrees, they want the Latin long. Um, with the newer elevation certificate, they are asking for 6 decimal places, so that might be a best practice over 5. But anyways, basically whatever the Latin long is on like the front porch is usually where it's taken. And then yeah, the datums need to be provided as well. And so they want your mapping information, so your NFIP community number. So every community that participates has a 6-digit number that identifies them in the program, and pretty much all of ours start with 200, except for Topeka, which is 205 for some reason, but it should be 200 and then another 3 digits. And then your map and panel number, they want the full number. So there is an abbreviation that we'll look at that gets, mistaken a lot on these forms as well as elevation certificates. But other than that, the base flood elevation here, so that needs to be calculated in whichever way it needs to be calculated. So they are looking at effective data, and so with a detailed study like an AE zone, there's, a set practice that corresponds to the flood insurance study and the flood profiles that are towards the end of that report. And if it's a zone A, we can help you calculate that. We have approximate base flood elevations that can be calculated based on the effective data that needs to be used. And so it is reliable. It is based on engineering, even though it's approximate. Sometimes people don't necessarily understand what all that entails, but it can be calculated and it would need to be for that particular site. And then the source of the BFE, usually like a surveyor, or you could put, KDA DWR if we are the ones helping you calculate it, and then the lowest adjacent grade. So again, the other important elevation factor here, to at least the nearest tenth of a foot. And we would use feet unless you're in Puerto Rico. So it's always to feet here in Kansas. And then, yep, at least 1 decimal point. Um, and then that they're going to take that compared to the base flood elevation. So it has to be at that same elevation or higher. And then elevation of the lowest grade on property. So if lowest lot elevation, so that's if you're doing a section of property or an entire property. And then the datum. So if it's not in the same datum as the map, it would need to be converted, and there is software to be able to do that because some of our older maps are in NGVD 29 instead of 88. So that's something to pay attention to because they can be off by a lot if you don't convert it or convert it correctly. So something to be aware of. And then Um, if FEMA has identified the area of subsidence or sorry, subsidence or uplift, we don't have many. I think down in the southeast part, there might be a little bit of subsidence from or subsidence from like mining projects, but it's not typically a concern that we have here. And then, of course, it needs to be certified by an engineer or a surveyor. We don't allow architects in Kansas to do that, so an engineer or a surveyor would then certify those elevations and submit it. So they did release some more detailed instructions in 2021. And so I think it's just kind of based on lessons learned and common mistakes that they went ahead and just kind of flushed out the use of the forms and probably like common questions that they get as well. I get these questions quite often, but these instructions are available and probably useful for an applicant if you have someone that has some questions about it. But yep. So as I mentioned, in part of that application, you have the NFIP community number, and that's a little bit blurry. I apologize, but we're looking at Shawnee County, and then it specifies Topeka under that. So that's where the full community number is. Um, and there's a couple other ways to find it, but it's definitely on every single firm panel. And so it starts, 200 and then whatever the rest of the number is. And then the full map and panel number there, um, towards the bottom. So yeah, 20177C is for county-wide, and then 0193, and then the suffix is E, which indicates how many times it's been updated. And then it'll have an effective date there. But towards the middle of that panel, it says 193 of 450, and that's actually an abbreviation. So when they ask for the full map and panel number, that's what they're asking for towards the bottom. That much longer number. And so this is kind of an example of an older map. So it's like a paper map that's been digitized, but we have a lot of areas that have digital firms, quite a bit of it. And so our goal is to map the entire state completely, but that takes a lot of time and work, so it hasn't been completed. Yep. And then, like I said, base flood elevation, if it's a detailed study, that would be from the flood insurance study, or if it's from an A zone, we do have that data available and we can help calculate that just upon request. And I should have a slide on our base flood elevation portal, but yeah, I'm not sure where in the presentation that is, but we do have a resource available where you can formally submit requests for base flood elevations in the A zone, so not a detailed study area. So if you're looking for these products, you can go to the Map Service Center. So this is where you can find all of the effective and even historical products for the community. We do have our um, effective floodplain viewer publicly available, and we use that quite often if you have a digital firm. Some communities are still on their paper maps, so they would come here. And so, um, yeah, you can just search for FEMA Map Service Center, and then you can enter an address if you want to in that search bar, and that will pull it up if it's digital. If you have paper maps only, then you would go to search all products. Or if you're looking for a copy of a letter of map change or your flood insurance study, that would be under search all products. So, whoops. So this is what happens if you use that search bar and you want to pull up just your digital map. This is FEMA's National Flood Hazard Layer, so it's their web map basically. Um, and then we have a Kansas specific one, but This is what their mapping looks like. It's very similar to ours. We just have it more state specific and we can customize it a little bit more, but you can also use the National Flood Hazard layer. And if you click Dynamic Map, it will create a map of whatever your area of interest is. And so this is just an example from our office address. And so that's our office located there. And then adjacent to it, we have our floodplain. So you can see the areas of floodway in the AE zone and then all the cross sections that go with that. Okay. So this is the dynamic map function. And so it's called a ferment. We have the same ability or capabilities on our version of the effective web map, but if you do it through FEMA's National Flood Hazard Layer, this is how it looks. So it will just go ahead and generate that legend for you, and it'll tell you at what time that I created it, and it just kind of has everything together. So submission of a map like this is part of the application package, I guess. And so you would need this uh, in addition to the either MT-Easy or the MT1 forms. But it's very detailed. It gives you all the zones and it's actually like colorblind friendly and it has your community number and name and the panel number, the effective date, basically everything that you would need for a ferment. So if you go to search all products, as I mentioned before, you would just enter your county and your community, and that would include the unincorporated areas as well. You can search those. I haven't really needed the jurisdiction name or product ID or anything like that. I guess if you know those exact details and what you're looking for, you could use those, but I have never really needed them. So um, this is what it looks like under effective products. I clicked on firm panels. I think this is still Shawnee County, yeah. Um, and Topeka. So it pulls up all of the different panels that you would need. So basically, um, your floodplain map is laid out in panels. And so, it's just one section of that community. So you would need to know which panel you're looking for in this case. The top product, so where it says CIND, that is the index, and basically it's a map of all your panels so you can see where they're laid out, and if you needed to locate a specific panel, you could do it that way. So it just kind of shows you how they're um, assembled, and then yeah, you probably don't want to download all of them. I mean, I guess in some cases you might, but you just try to avoid that button as much as possible, and then yeah, your list of panels. So this is what an index map looks like. This is an older one of Lawrence, but basically it gives you some major landmarks like the airports, railroads, major highways, that kind of thing, so you can orient yourself and, locate the panel that you're needing. And so if you're in search all products and then you open a panel, you have the ability to create a ferment that way. And so you can see the mapping looks a little bit different. It's not quite as colorful. It's all the floodplain zones are outlined in blue. And so it kind of has like this little stippling, but it has the boundary of the floodplain in black. And then it still has like the cross hatching for the floodway. So it's similar, it's just a little bit different style, and then you can see like a black and white aerial photograph in the background. So same information, it's just presented a little bit differently, but you just decide what size you want. It gives you, the default 8 by 11. And then you would drag that green box in the upper left-hand corner, drag that over your area of interest, and then it'll let you place a scale and a north arrow, and then it'll like highlight those other um, grayed out boxes to the bottom right. So it'll let you position the north arrow and then it'll give you the title block and then you would just preview and save it. And yeah, PDF or PNG file, either way. Um, Basically the same process, and then you just have that. And we make these all the time, not just, when people are applying for letters of map change, but it's good to make these to go with a permit or, whatever the case may be for that. And then you just save them geographically for each property. And then, of course, keep those on file in perpetuity. Yes. And so that's what it looks like if you do it this way. And it gives you all of the mapping information that you would need for, like I said, a permit, an elevation certificate, and of course in support of the LOMA application. Right. So the base flood and the source of the base flood, we talked about this a little bit. Of course, in those detailed areas, they would be using the flood insurance study. And then as the floodplain administrator, you would want to check that and just, make sure it's at least reasonable for what they've calculated. A lot of mistakes have been made. A lot of rounding has been done, like the base flood elevations that are on the map there. Those are rounded. Um, so where the cross sections are, they are calculated, and then those correspond to the flood insurance study and the flood profiles that I mentioned. So the either surveyor or engineer would use those to measure what the base flood elevation is. And so in this particular map, you can see it's like a confluence of two streams. And so they might have to calculate two BFEs if it's near that confluence and then take whichever is higher. So um, that's what happens in those cases. Oops. So this can all be done on paper. For communities that have paper maps, which is this is kind of what it's aimed at, as long as you've printed the map true to size so that there is no like skewing of the scale, you could technically do this on paper. Yeah, most of the time we're doing this in GIS software, and so that's not the case most of the time, but technically you could do this on paper, and we do have another recorded training on our YouTube channel, which is on our website on calculating base flood elevations when you have this detailed study. Um, and so this is just one method. Um, that comes up with paper maps, but so that's the example that you see here. But since we measure along the stream channel, we've utilized just some colored string and follow the same exact methodology. And so the X is the location of the house, and so you're measuring between the upstream and downstream cross sections. And then there's a very simple formula that goes into what the actual calculation is. And then you would just check that with the flood profile. So yep, you'd measure along there, along the stream channel though, not just straight. Um, I was, th there have been some arguments for measuring it straight, but the accepted methodology is along the stream channel. And so, like I said, most of the time we're in GIS doing this, and so we do have that recording available. And then this is the flood profile. So this is kind of close up, but you saw that we were measuring between cross sections L and M. And so that's where you would um, look to in the flood insurance study. And so just making sure that you have the correct flooding source, the correct stream that's in here. But basically, it's like a graphical representation of that mapping. And so you have the channel bed there. That's that bottom line. And then above that, you have the different flood frequencies. So, of course, we're measuring to the 100-year stream. And then wherever the location is along between L and M. So we've marked that, and then you just go straight up wherever that intersects with the 100-year flood. You just go straight across horizontally, and that will give you your base flood elevation. So we have 1278.2. Um, and so you would just go through and make sure that the applicant has this correct. I mean, you may not even be involved in the process potentially if they're just working with a surveyor on their own, but of course you might get some questions. So this is how it's done for the detailed study. Um, I'm not going fully into it. Like I said, we do have the other training, but it's a very simple process because basically all of the work has been done for you um, by the engineering and mapping that has gone into a detailed study. So you can look at the floodway data table. Am I saying that right? I think. So you can see where L and M, those cross sections are, and it will give you all of the information that goes with that. And of course, we're looking at the regulatory, which is the 100-year elevations, and just making sure that whatever base flood elevation you've got is between 1277.4 and 1279.0. Because if you're outside of that range, then something has gone wrong. I've done this where I was looking at the wrong stream, so a completely different set of L and M cross sections or whatever the case was. So just double checking your work, double checking anything that gets submitted to you. Oops. Okay. And of course, why are we using the flood insurance study? Why is that important? This was an actual case where the surveyor just took the rounded base flood elevation from the map. And so we don't ever do that unless we're looking at like a, a lake or something like that. And there's always guidance on how these things should be calculated, but in this case, they took that rounded number 1277 and then the top of the bottom floor ended up at 1278.1. And so it ended up not being built high enough. So we need to not take any rounded numbers and actually go into the flood insurance study and calculate it or make sure that it was calculated. And of course, it needs to be 1/10 of a foot. So it needs at least one decimal place. And this was not done in this case. And, it comes back to like our freeboard rules and everything. So it can be a very costly mistake to not check that. As I mentioned, if it's a zone A, those can be formally requested through our BFE portal. And so, um, this is our website where you can register for an account and then you can go in and submit requests. So, um, you can also just go in and look at the LiDAR data, and you can look at the approximate lowest adjacent grade, which is accurate to plus or minus a foot. Um, so you can see all the requests throughout the entire state. But if you go into an area and you just click around, like up in the left-hand corner, you can see it's been kind of um, blown up, but it'll show you the LiDAR value, which again is accurate to plus or minus a foot. And this might be a good step for someone who's unsure if their application would be approved or not. We can kind of give you an idea of what elevations you're looking at and whether or not you're a good candidate for a LOMA. Because, of course, the survey is expensive and getting those, elevations certified and then submitted it's not worth the effort if it's just going to be denied. So we do recommend that. And this is a really great resource for, multiple reasons, not just LOMAs, but, other things too. So basically, you would go in and you would draw the property as accurately as possible. So you're just putting a polygon over that building footprint, and then you just submit. And of course, definitely fill out um, all the information, as much information as possible, so that we can, you know, properly process that request because there are different purposes. So in this case, it was a LOMA, and then um, certainly include your address. That's important and something that can cause a delay if you leave that out. As accurate an address as possible, and then save it, and then we get in touch with you within 5 days. Um, we'll at least respond or like request more information, or we'll send you our determination. And so you get a letter that looks like this, and it gives you the base flood elevation calculation and then the approximate lowest adjacent grade that's based on the LiDAR information. Very useful. Again, this is just for zone A's. If it's a detailed area, you should be looking at the flood insurance study. Um, and it's important to know that you could encounter a mistake in the flood insurance study. We've had that happen a few times. So just looking at multiple sources of information, but yeah, this is a very useful tool. And then just a little bit about how this relates to flood insurance, because many times people are wanting to get out of the required flood insurance mandatory purchase requirement. And so uh, the LOMA will remove that unless the lender determines otherwise. And so a lender has the prerogative to require it anyways. And so sometimes it's good to affirm whether or not you're required to have flood insurance just based on your flood zone. Because, if you're just trying to get out of that, if they're going to require it anyways, you may as well not try for a LOMA. But it used to be that might change your um, rate, your premium. That is no longer the case. However, your flood premium is completely separate from that. So your premium does not change regardless of a LOMA. So if you have flood insurance, it's calculated. Um, we're not sure how all of these things factor in exactly, like how they're weighted, but definitely your base flood elevation, your distance to the flooding source, your relative elevation to that, catastrophe models, replacement cost, your history of NFIP claims, of course, the mapping data, and all of those things kind of factor into whatever your premium comes out as, but we don't really have a, clarity on that. So these are just the factors that we know go into it, but we're not exactly sure how that's calculated. There can be alterations to a structure that makes it safer, that might qualify for a discount. So elevated machinery and equipment is a 5% discount, and there is a whole schematic that's basically depending on what type of foundation, like what elevation diagram that structure fits into, will determine where those have to be elevated to. Proper flood venting, so in this case, a crawl space, um, can go into a discount. And then credit based on lowest adjacent grade, first floor height, and foundation type can go into that, and also like what type of construction you have. So they all kind of factor into it. Yeah, but of course there is like flood opening requirements for an enclosure like that. Um, so we do have 2018 LiDAR. I think that's still um, as recent as it's been. And that's what that's based on. And so DASC is the Data Access and Support Center. And so they have a lot of data for the state that can be accessed. So if you have questions on the mapping itself, or LiDAR and DASC maybe. Well, DASC is a bit separate from us, but we do work with them, and they host our base flood elevation portal and things like that. But Joanna and Alex are our mapping people for the most part. Keegan is a little bit as well. So they could probably answer those types of questions, whereas I'm more on like the regulation side of things. But we do have 2D base level engineering or BLE, and so it's a very um, like basic, I don't want to say basic. It's, like the basis of how we do our mapping projects. We have that across the state. They're just not refined in the way that would be required for regulatory approval from FEMA to become the effective maps. And so we have this modeling basically that shows where flood risk is at the very minimum level. And so it's been 2D mapping projects for quite some time now. And of course, start to finish, those could take upwards of 5 years. But we are consistently mapping across the state. But we do have this information available mostly um, in I guess I wouldn't say it that way. We have it available for communities that have never been mapped before, and then we've been working towards getting an approved model ordinance that would allow those communities to participate and then regulate to the BLE just because it's their best available data. And of course, they don't, as I mentioned, they don't have maps, or some communities have maps from the like mid 70s, and so it's just very outdated and, the BLE is probably more, refined than those really old maps. So that's been our goal. We just haven't gotten it approved, but we're definitely willing to work with communities to, progress that goal. Um, in case there is flood risk that they should be aware of, even if it's not on an effective map, we do have this data. Um, and then I don't have a more updated map than this, but we have been uh, progressing. And so the grant that supports our mapping efforts is the CTP grant, or the Cooperating Technical Partners grant. Um, and so if you've been, keeping up with FEMA in the news and things, that grant has not been approved yet. Um, whereas it definitely would have been by now, but there's a lot of uncertainty about funding with FEMA, and so that's just kind of where we are with that. But we have been, progressing on these maps. We have a couple of counties that are going to have their letter of final determination come out next month. And so basically, that's the letter where FEMA announces that the new maps will become effective in 6 months and the communities must adopt their new maps. And so, um, how we do this, it's like is it a 3 or 5 year grant? Anyways, it's like a couple of years, and then we start new projects, and we start at the watershed scale, and then we break it down all the way down to the county. So that's why I mentioned county-wide maps. Um, like in their map and panel number, the C is for county-wide, and that's how we've been doing it. And so um, we have been mapping across the state, and we continue to make progress on that. And then I mentioned before our effective floodplain viewer. So this is what that looks like. If you've never visited before, it's a very useful tool, and it just has all of our digital floodplain mapping available. And so you can put on the base map. I like to use the aerial imagery, and we use this quite frequently. And so, um, yeah, I forget I lost my train of thought. I'm sorry. So you can see the different zones there. So we have zone A and AE in the screenshots, and so you can make a fermet, like I mentioned. It's called print map. So if you see, like kind of in the middle of the screen on the left side, if you go to print function, it will also create a fermet for you. So this is how it looks. So I made this in for Lawrence. But yeah, um, also we have our approximate base flood elevations for the zone A, and that's something that you won't find on the National Flood Hazard Layer. And so we just kind of have these different layers of information that you can add to it that's not on the National Flood Hazard layer. So specific to Kansas, and then you can always, make your map. Um, and this would be fine in support of a LOMA application. It has all the information that they're needing. And so I mentioned something like this earlier. If there's two elevations that overlap on the same property, where this confluence is occurring, um, you might have to calculate for both of those situations. So again, using the cross sections and then taking the higher number. So just something to be aware of. And yes, new mapped areas are added every year. As I mentioned, we are working to get everyone mapped. It does take a lot of funding and work and time. Like I mentioned, it's like a 5-year process to get it to the level of refinement that then goes through multiple reviews through many different engineers and then with FEMA. And then with the community, of course, we have a lot of community involvement, community-based meetings, and then towards the end of that process, we do have an open house with the public so that the public can come in and look at the maps and even their specific properties to make any comments that they might have on that. And that, again, is towards the end, but at the point where we can still make corrections easily enough without having to go through an entire like appeal process. And so there is an appeal period where the community can submit for changes to the map after most of the finalization has been done. But yeah, we have lots of presentations on our website, and you can see where your communities, your counties are in that process, or if they just have not been started yet, or if they've been completed. As I mentioned, we do this all year, working on new maps. So yeah, I realize this is a little bit old map. I don't know if we've updated our status map, but like I said, these things don't move too quickly. So um, yeah, we have like I think Allen and Cherokee coming out next month, and uh, a lot of these have made progress since then, but you can kind of see like our progress across the state. Okay, so back to the MTEZ section 5, lowest adjacent grade. Again, that's the determining factor on whether or not it's going to be approved, whether it's at or above base flood elevation that's been calculated. And so that's really all FEMA cares about is that the lag is high enough. So I mentioned um, on an MT1 form, if there's a basement and it's on natural grade, there is the intervening higher grade, potential intervening higher ground, and so the lowest adjacent grade would be at the bottom of the window well. But if the surrounding ground is high enough on natural ground, again, not fill, if it's at or above the base flood elevation, FEMA may approve a LOMA for that. So I have seen that happen. I have kind of gone through that process with someone to help them fix the compliance issue, but yeah, they were able to use the potential intervening higher grade. And so it's kind of like that, but the loading dock at the bottom, I have been told if the natural grade is covered in like concrete and impervious surface, that they might deny it just based on that. But again, it kind of depends on the reviewer and those specific details. So a loading dock could potentially have the intervening higher grade, but it's not likely. So the lowest adjacent grade is at the bottom of that. Again, wherever the lowest point touches the structure, that's the lag. So that's just like one caveat to basements. So I've really only seen it approved on like residential buildings. But yeah, it doesn't really matter what kind of window well, even though that one is kind of covered in plexiglass and things like that. That would be the lowest adjacent grade at the bottom of that window well, or the other window well, or if you the loading docks, the lowest point of that concrete. So it could be approved, it might not. Um, and so in one of the approvals, not the one I was talking about, but a different one, this was an attachment that was submitted with the application to sketch out the intervening higher grade and the window wells situation. So we have this little sketch that just kind of supported, um, that logic and that request. So this might be something good to include with an application that involving a basement on natural grade. And then they have a checklist for you. So in addition to this form, complete the checklists below. So you need a copy of the effective firm panel, and so that's where the permit may come in, and it tells you, you know, all the mapping information, and that it's been accurately plotted, and then a plat map, um, with the recorder's office stamp or a copy of the deed accompanied with a tax assessor's map. And then making sure that your map has a scale and a north arrow, and then making sure that you're not submitting your original documents. They just want copies of that. And then, of course, FEMA is encouraging the submission in digital format. So they have the online submission portal. Um, it's not like I've used that or um, have an account or anything like that, and most people don't. I think usually like the surveyor or the engineer is the one submitting, so they, are used to working with it and have access to that. I am working with someone who's trying to submit an application through the postal mail, and I don't really know how that's going. And I don't know if FEMA's keeping up with their 60-day timeline turnaround either. They've lost a lot of staffing, so I don't know if that's impacted this process, but it's possible. The ferment again, submit that. Just kind of another example. In this area, it's protected by a certified levee, so that's why it looks that way. And again, this is via the National Flood Hazard Layer, so FEMA's web map that you can access through the Map Service Center. Uh, just another example. And then, like the person I was just talking about, there's a LOMA out as shown determination. So sometimes the lender will say that you have to have flood insurance because you're in the floodplain, even though the floodplain is only on part of the property and it doesn't actually touch the structure. Then you can get a LOMA out as shown, basically saying that the structure is actually outside of the special flood hazard area. So this is pretty common. Um, they will use like third-party vendors that just kind of run a program. And so if that program detects that there's floodplain on your property, they will flag you as being in, and then that would trigger the flood insurance requirement. So this is a process to undo that um, at the individual level that you can apply for this. And so you don't have to have a survey done for this. There's detailed instructions available online. Um, so you would fill out at least, I think, the first page of the MTEZ form and then a copy of the deed, the ferment that you would create, and then like the community map. So like I mentioned, like a plat map or the tax assessor's map with a good aerial photo, and then this should be easy to complete. So property owners can do this themselves. Like I said, I just walked someone through this process. And there's, really good instructions that I think were released in 2018. But yeah, it's pretty detailed in those. Yep, this. It goes through the entire documentation and submittal process. So I just sent this to someone through the postal mail, this instruction. Um, So yeah, it should be pretty straightforward in this process, but someone might ask about it, um, and then uh, you'd be able to provide them with this. Um, so detailed step-by-step instructions, a format copy of the deed, um, and then yeah, that the MTEZ application. If you already have an elevation certificate for a structure, you can attach that to the MTEZ form, and so you wouldn't have to have like a separate survey done. Um, so a copy of the elevation certificate can be done, used in support of a LOMA request. And of course, this is only for structures because the EC form would only cover the elevations of a structure and not have like the meets and bounds for either a property or a section of property that would have to be done separately. But this is a good tidbit to know. And then an elevation certificate is usually kept with the deed, like at the county recorder's office. So that's a good place to check if you're not sure if it has an elevation certificate. And then FEMA does have these online letter of map change fact sheets, so these should be pretty easy to find online. And of course, they've been encouraging online submittal. And then, yeah, so I've only met a few people that insist on going through the postal mail, but there is an address for that. And then, of course, sometimes people feel like a sense of security if they have a LOMA and, it gets approved and they cancel their flood insurance. It doesn't mean that you have no risk. It does put you at a lower risk category, but there's always a risk. Where it rains, it can flood. So we try to encourage flood insurance, but of course, many people it's kind of a lot in expense for them. So a lot of people like to cancel their insurance policies, but it's just good to remind people that, it doesn't mean you don't have any risk. You could still flood, and then there's not really much you can do to recover after that. Assistance is rare. You have to have a presidentially declared disaster to have that available to you, and then it's not a whole lot, or it ends up being a loan with interest. And so, um, we always encourage flood insurance it's the best way to recover from that. Another thing about LOMAs is like the ones that are denied, um, they look a lot like an approved LOMA. And so we've had people that thought they had an approved LOMA or a LOMR-F and they didn't. So I don't know why they make it almost identical, but if you look in the top right-hand corner of that first document, it says LOMA DEN, which means denied. And compared to the other that just says LOMA, and then in kind of that title section, it says non-removal means it was not removed from the flooded plain. And so they put those numbers right next to each other, the BFE and the lag. And so it has to be at or above that elevation. Whereas the approved one, it looks different. So it would be nice if they kind of differentiated that a little bit more, but it's something to be aware of. Um, so again, just some last thoughts here on the LOMA. It may not remove the insurance requirement, which depends on the lender. Um, if you have a map change, so a map update, um, they will evaluate the letters of map change. And so some of them may be like incorporated. So that means they've just gone ahead and like not mapped it into the floodplain, or not incorporated, or superseded is the hard one because that invalidates the letter. And of course, that's not nice news to get. And then there's a to be redetermined part of it. So I haven't really seen that happen though, but this will all come to you ahead of time in your summary of map actions. And then a revalidation letter is sent out, you know, that tells you which ones are still valid. So there's different, they will give you a reason why your letter was superseded. Usually the the elevation is below the new base flood elevation, and there's been, revised hydraulics and hydrologics analyses, differences in topographic info. Of course, the community develops and changes around you, so once they remap it, the conditions may not allow for a map to remain valid. So we definitely encourage communication with those property owners so they know as soon as possible before that it gets invalidated or they are their lender redetermines their flood zone. Okay, let me see. What time is it? Okay. Right at the top of the hour again. Let's take a 5-minute break. But if you want credit, the continuing education credit, I'll need you to answer the poll question. So, Keegan, the first poll question, I know Joanna checked it this morning, but it should be uh, involving the MTEZ form if you wanted to launch that. So, when can the MTEZ form be used? And you don't have to get it correct. I just want you to participate in order to get that credit. Give me a couple more seconds to respond to that. Does it look like most people have finished, Keegan?
I've got 17 out of 25.
Okay, great. So if you wanted to end that, yeah, it's a single residential structure. So if you're in the floodway, you need to use the MT1 form and not the MTEZ. All right. Um, I think we could probably just come back at 11. I don't know. It feels weird to just come back at like a random time, like 10 after 11. Does that sound okay? Um, yeah, we'll take a pause there and then we'll get into the LOMR-F. All right, everyone, it's 10 after 11, so I will go ahead and continue. Hopefully everyone's back from the break. So now we'll focus on the letter of map revision based on fill, or the LOMR-F. So I think I mentioned this earlier. If fill was placed on the property before it was identified as a flood-prone area or a floodplain, then that material can be considered natural grade. So you would want to check the dates. And so that's kind of part of the MT1 question about the date of the construction. Um, so a property owner with a house on a fill pad could file for a LOMA in that situation, and then it would be approved in accordance with Part 70 of the CFR. So again, if it's been there after that time period, then it becomes a LOMR-F application. um, in accordance with Part 65. So it's not treated as natural grade. And there's a lot of instances where FEMA definitely treats earth and fill a lot different than natural grade. So again, MT1 form for the LOMR-F application. So this would be, again, used for LOMAs on a commercial property, a LOMA in the floodway, or for multiple properties. But it's always used for the LOMR-F. And so we see this section again where you choose what the application is for, as far as like LOMA, CLOMA, LOMR-F, or CLOMR-F. And then they ask for when the fill was placed or when will it be placed in the case of a conditional letter. And yeah, and then there's like a little asterisk at the bottom that says you will comply with the Endangered Species Act. And so that needs to be documented to FEMA prior to issuance of a conditional letter. And if you do a LOMR-F, they are assuming that you have verified compliance with the Endangered Species Act, or ESA. And then the floodplain administrator signs off on that in the community acknowledgement form. So again, with the expiring forms, it expired in 2014, and we are still in a grace period as we have not gotten a new form yet. So like I mentioned, there is an MT2 application for a LOMAR, or a letter of map revision. It has nothing to do with fill necessarily. Um, any type of project that would change floodway boundaries. Alluvial fans, we don't really have those areas except I think in like extreme western Kansas. Structures that have been elevated on fill in the floodway, that's a very big deal. And there's probably multiple permits for doing something like that. Channelization projects, bridge and culvert replacements, any flood control improvements. Of course, we don't have coastal high hazard areas in Kansas, but basically these are your bigger projects. So there's usually, like multiple entities involved in that. And so the MT2 form is a lot more complicated and technical. It's not typically something that would be needed by an individual property owner. These are usually like bigger projects, like I said, like bridge and culvert replacement type projects. And the type of thing that would probably need multiple permits, so like a DWR state permit, especially for anything working in a regulated stream, um, and fill. So I think that's something I haven't mentioned yet, is like if fill is on average a foot or more, it's also going to need a state permit from us for floodplain fill, in addition to the community permit. So that's something to be aware of. And then, of course, these projects would probably need like also a U.S. Army Corps of Engineer type permit, or something like that. We do have recorded training on how to do a LOMAR, obviously from an engineering standpoint, because those would be the applicants for that type of project, or a LOMAR. But just so that you're aware of this as a completely separate process from a LOMAR-F or a LOMA. So the property information form, basically, we've looked at this quite a bit, but basically whatever type of letter you're applying for, and then it has a description of that. So a LOMR-F, the conditional, is a letter stating that that parcel of land or proposed structure that's going to be elevated on fill would not be inundated if it's built as proposed. And then the LOMR-F, basically the existing structure of land has been elevated by fill, would not be inundated by the base flood. So basically, it's already been put in place. They've got their DWR permit and their community permit to go ahead and construct that, and then they submit the documentation that shows the top of that fill pad is removed from the floodplain. So people are still, like, for all intents and purposes, legally considered to be in the floodplain until these things are filed. So if you get a CLOMA or a CLOMAR-F, you still have to then follow up and um, apply for that LOMA or LOMAR-F. Um, there is a bit of a discount if you've gotten a CLOMAR-F for the LOMAR-F, but LOMAs do not have a fee associated with them. So I think we'll look at the fee schedule here in a couple of slides. But again, timing is everything with fill. So you can see this is freshly placed, fill pad and structure. Um, but you include that as part of the application. So it asks for when that was placed, the month and year. And again, that relates to it being considered fill or natural grade. So definitely fill in this case. Um, so the Endangered Species Act, I mentioned this. Basically, FEMA got caught in quite a bit of litigation regarding this, and so they ended up placing the burden, I guess, onto communities to make sure that this has been looked at. And so, things have kind of changed over the last couple of years in how they do this and how they've utilized their resources. Um, but I have another slide on the Endangered Species Act, but again, towards the bottom, if it's multiple structures or lots, it would always be the MT1 form, even if it's a LOMA. Um, but yeah, it asks about structures on the property, dates of construction, um, whether it's a portion of the property or the entire legally recorded property that's being applied for. So, the Endangered Species Act, federal law, typically in undeveloped areas. So it could be like projects in unincorporated areas that might need to worry about this that have like rare or endangered species. Um, and there's ways to check this, but it could require an incidental take permit. I haven't really come across this a whole lot. It's kind of outside of our agency. We do have a U.S. Fish and Wildlife field office in Manhattan that could probably assist anyone that was concerned about the Endangered Species Act. Um, there's supposed to be new guidance coming. I don't know how soon that actually is going to be, with all the federal changes that have gone on. Um, they were able to settle at least one lawsuit in California, and of course, all this litigation, takes a lot of time. But we do have the Kansas Wildlife and Parks website that lists these species by county. So that could give you an idea if a project is going to, impact a species like that. But again, we have the Manhattan field office that I feel could probably answer questions in that regard. And then they do have the information for planning and consulting website. And so basically it's where you could put together an application package just to check on any endangered species concerns. And so it sounded like U.S. Fish and Wildlife might now be requiring the use of this website. And that website does have a lot of training on how to use it and things. They have a lot of videos on that website. So if that ever becomes a concern, we do have those resources. but like I said, it hasn't really come up very much as far as any species that we were concerned about. So you can email them if you wanted to at the field office, and their information's down there in the bottom. But typically, how this has been done before was like an email description of the work, and then like a map of the area with that. But I don't know what their guidance is coming back like at this point, or if they're requiring the use of the IPAC website or whatever the case may be. But I'm sure they could give more information than I can. So this is the Department of Wildlife and Parks website and how it looks, and the list of threatened and endangered species that could be impacted. And then this is just kind of their uh, field office website, if you ever wanted to, look at that. Uh, yeah, this is the IPAC website. They did do quite a bit of updating to this over the last couple of years, so you can see the different options you have here. A regulatory review, where you get an official species list, and I think it will, filter out species depending on like the time of year you're wanting to do the work and those kinds of things. Um, or there's like a consultation package builder. Uh, and I guess this has saved them a lot of time in the review process, that they have this formalized website. Uh, I haven't really used it. I've just kind of played around in it to try to get an idea. Obviously, I've never needed it myself for any kind of project, but just to inform others. But they have uploaded a lot of training. And then I'm not sure if this is still the case, um, because we did kind of like a fictional project right when it was first released. And so we got a letter like this. We had a hypothetical fill project and we entered it. But I think when I tried to redo this, they were requiring a lot more specific information before I could submit for it. So, um, as you can see, this one's from 2018 and they have updated quite a bit since then. So I don't know if you would still get a letter like this or whatever the case may be. There was also speculation as to whether FEMA would accept that or not. Yeah, I'm not really sure. Like I said, I haven't really dealt with it very much, but this is their tool that they've been using. And then there is flood risk and endangered species habitat. So this is kind of like a mapping uh, resource that they have. So it was FEMA's mapping tool. I don't know if this is still being used or updated. I know there was like a CRS activity that could um, add points if you went through this process and made one of their plans, I think, but I haven't really used it much. I've only been to like one training on this, and I'm not sure if this is still in use, but it is something else that's available. I don't know if it's updated or uh, not, but uh, it's another resource that we have in case you were ever concerned about endangered species. There's lots of things that we can look at. And of course, reach out if you have questions. But again, they have a checklist towards the end of this to make sure that you have all of the information and documents that they're asking for. So they ask you to complete the checklist, and like the LOMA, you need an effective firm ferment that has all that mapping information on it, a subdivision plat map for the property, or you have that other option, the property deed with the stamp on it. Form 2 is the elevation form. Again, you can use an elevation certificate in place of that. And so the FEMA reviewers just kind of approve or deny these things. They don't really look at compliance. So like if your community has, higher freeboard or really, I guess statewide, any freeboard, they don't look at any of that. They're only looking at, if it's qualifying for a letter of map change having the lag at or above the base flood elevation. So compliance is a completely separate thing that's entirely on the community for approving a permit. And then making sure, I guess, that your map, of course, has a north arrow and the scale on it. Form 3, that's the important one, or I guess they're all important, but that's an important one, the community acknowledgement form. So there's a statement there that the floodplain administrator signs off on saying that this construction is going to comply with all state and federal laws as well as their local adopted regulations. So basically, anything with a LOMR-F still has to be built in compliance, meaning the lowest floor is at least 1 foot above the base flood elevation or higher if you have a higher freeboard. Um, so that's an important thing to note, and I think we'll be able to look at that statement in a few slides from now. And we'll take a close look at that because it's really important to ensure all of those things before you sign off on it. And then documented ESA compliance or an incidental take permit. I think the IPAC website does generate something that affirms that, but again, it's kind of not really clear if that's being accepted or not. And again, sometimes it just depends on who you're working with at FEMA. But um, basically, they are making sure that you have looked at the Endangered Species Act and make sure that you're not doing an incidental take without permitting. Um, and then again, FEMA's trying to encourage digital formats, and I'm still dealing with people that don't work with any kind of digital media. So that could be one of the challenges that you face. And I've been trying to work with that through postal mail. So, oops. And then here's the payment part. So it shows you the different costs for these different letters of map change. Um, like I said, a LOMAR-F following a CLOMAR-F, it's a little bit less expensive. Um, but it is insurance from FEMA that, if you build as proposed, we will approve that letter. But you do have to file it after the conditional letter. And then just the different payment structures there. Again, LOMAs do not have a fee associated with them. And then definitely check yes for email so you can have um, clear and straight through communication with them. And then, of course, we don't want to have people submitting LOMAR Fs that are not going to be accepted. Um, this is Technical Bulletin 10. It came out in 2023 and it does supersede Technical Bulletin 10-01. I don't know why it is, but I still see people like citing that one that came out in 2001. It has some language in there regarding basements that is not accurate or applicable to us about there being like no water in it or something like that. Basically, we're not allowed to build new basements and not even in fill. And so what happened was people were building fill pads and then digging into them after it was approved and removed from the floodplain. Then they got the LOMR-F. They would then dig into it and build a basement in the fill. Um, And once the LOMR-F is approved, it's outside of the special flood hazard area technically, and so it's not subject to those regulations anymore. And so FEMA tried to close that loophole by putting in the community acknowledgement form with that statement. So any LOMR-F application that you get, you should be checking the proposed construction on it before signing off on it. To make sure that the lowest floor is still going to be at least 1 foot above the base flood elevation. So if someone is putting in fill, it's pretty safe to assume that they're going to construct something on it. So we want to look at that and make sure that it's compliant before signing off. And so That's how they've tried to fix that. But yeah, once it's approved, we can't really do much about it. And then again, I mentioned this earlier about the intervening higher grade. It would have to be on natural grade. So it wouldn't be acceptable if that was fill and they built a basement. So natural grade only, and that would not be accepted for a LOMR-F. And again, the lag would be at the bottom of the window well or at the base of that ramp. And so it would be denied. So that's something to keep in mind. What's acceptable for LOMAs is not always acceptable for a LOMR-F. And it shouldn't be for a community either, since they have to sign off on the compliance aspect of it. So yeah, those examples, and then same thing with the walkout basement. The lowest adjacent grade would be at that bottom step there. Definitely not acceptable for new construction in the special flood hazard area. That would definitely be a violation. Oops. Um, yep, so that's the end of that form. It's just a signature and, the mailing address and that type of information for the property information form. And then the elevation form. So this is where we have that information about the different structural aspects, but of course it is including an attached deck or garage. So those things are also considered when we're looking at the lowest adjacent grade. So it says there um, the lowest ground touching the structure. So um, yeah, it's good. Yeah, incomplete submissions will result in processing delays. Like I said, they might reach out for more information. So very much the same information. Of course, this is still the MT1 form. Community number. So we looked at the fermet and the six-digit number that you need. Address. If your elevations are based on existing or proposed conditions, and then the existing structures listed below, what types of construction, and check all that applies. So again, we're looking at crawl spaces. Is it a slab on grade, a basement, or other? Um, and then if there's any area of subsidence or uplift, that's typically not something we'll have to deal with. I think maybe a little bit in Cherokee County. Um, and then the elevation data. And then it's reminding you if they were computed using a different datum, what was the conversion factor? And so I think I have screenshots of that software and then the latitude and longitude of the structure or the property. Um, and I don't know if I mentioned the community status book. I think that's our next slide. So if you just type in like community status book or community or Kansas community status book, it should pull up and show you what that community ID number is. So again, that six-digit number, and pretty much all of them start with 200 for Kansas. So freely, publicly available. Again, you would find it in the Map Service Center if you went there as well. That's another way of finding it. So proposed conditions, that's where we're getting our conditional. So a CLOMAR-F, and then you follow that up with the LOMAR-F application. And then if it's for a portion of the property, you would include the lowest ground elevation within that meets and bounds description. So the lowest lot elevation, it's basically the same thing as a lag to a structure. Um, so that's there in the elevation form. Again, you could use an elevation certificate, but yeah, and then of course if there's multiple properties. And so in this case, we are looking at a manufactured home that's on top of basically a foundation wall that's been filled in. And so you can clearly see the fill there. This is just a good example. They filled it and then placed the manufactured home on top of that. And then you would see the lowest adjacent grade would include deck or stairs. So we're including the stairs in that determination. And then it looks like it does go a little bit lower towards the bottom of those stairs, so that might be the location of the lag, but of course that would be included on that. So this is the conversion software that I mentioned. I think it used to be VertCon, and then they switched to the NCAT. Um, and so yeah, this I believe this is the most up to date. I think they changed it at least once a couple of years ago, but this is where um, those can be converted. And of course, the National Geodetic Survey, they manage the benchmarks as well that surveyors use. And they're, listed and mapped where all those markers are. So, and I mentioned the community acknowledgement form, um, which is signed off on by the community, and you should read all of the instructions on this page before signing. It's very important. Has to be completed for all LOMR-Fs. Yeah, it's really important. So they're asking for the six-digit number. Um, and of course, if you didn't include that, then they would have to reach out and that would cause a delay. But this is the statement. So places to fill. The community is a f- the community official, the floodplain administrator, is responsible for the floodplain management. So they have reviewed this CLOMAR or LOMAR-F request. So it's you find the complete or proposed project meets or is designed to meet all of the community floodplain management requirements. So again, that's kind of how they've tried to get out of that loophole of people building basements after they got an approved letter. Is that you sign off that the proposed construction is going to comply with your regulations, meaning all the requirements outlined for specific like residential construction. So at the very least, that's 1 foot of freeboard and definitely no basements. Um, and there's no fill in the floodway. And then it says all necessary state, federal, and local permits have been secured or will be obtained. Compliance with the Endangered Species Act. Um, And so they've kind of really cracked down on that in this last update of the form because, as I mentioned, they ended up in a lot of litigation over the Endangered Species Act. And so, in addition, determined that the land and any existing proposed structures to be removed from the special flood hazard area are or will be reasonably safe from flooding. And so that's basic language from the CFR. But again, we do have our freeboard rules and everything, so those have to be complied with. And so I would not sign off on this until you have definitely ensured that and reviewed the construction. And, as part of construction, we would like to do some inspections throughout that process to make sure that the proposed plans are being uh, followed through on because you'd be surprised at, the things people try to get away with sometimes. Um, or just making sure that there's, not a mistake being made. But that's just, part of the typical permitting process. But again, once they have an approved letter, there's not really much that can be done. Um, and so that's why I really stress this part. There have been some communities that really just did not understand this part, but yeah, the design is going to meet all of the community management requirements. So again, no basements in new developments. We've tried to close out that loophole, at least 1 foot of BFE, that's statewide. Um, and of course, it has to meet the FEMA minimums for approval, but again, they've put the burden on the community to ensure compliance with any higher standards and just their basic floodplain management regulations. Of course, reasonably safe from flooding is always in there. You might need a state permit for fill, and then a violation of that could be tied into a low floor issue. So we've definitely had that happen before. Um, A lot of mistakes with these. And you can adopt LOMR-F areas into your ordinance and just basically saying that all areas that have been removed from the SFHA with a LOMR-F still needs to comply. And of course, that stands with the community acknowledgement form, but it might also help with enforcement issues and compliance to just add that into the ordinance and just make it clear. And then typically higher standards like that have always held up in court, since they are performance standards that protect life and property. So, um, worst case scenario, something could go to court. Typically, the courts have sided with the higher standards and the community on enforcement. So, the community acknowledgement form, again, it's a current or proposed project. Federal, state, and local permits, making sure that no fill has been put in the regulatory floodway, and then just checking on the Endangered Species Act, which again we haven't run into too much, but it might be something that is requested. And then I think you should be able to use the IPAC website or ask U.S. Fish and Wildlife. Um, and of course, reasonably safe from flooding is designed or defined as flood waters not inundating that land or structures that are going to be removed, and any subsurface waters related to the base flood would not damage them. So you have a building constructed on top of solid fill, and the top of that fill pad is at or above the base flood elevation, and that's reasonably safe from flooding. And of course, we've already signed off that it's still going to comply with the floodplain regulations. Um, just a case that had happened. So the lowest adjacent grade on next to a porch, which was, the lowest point touching the foundation. So they removed that and then they put fill around that area. Um, and it had let me see, sorry, removed and replaced with a cement slab, and then earth material was placed up around that and the existing foundation that would raise the lowest adjacent grade. And they got denied because they had a non-compliant basement. So it's like people who add fill around their crawl space, if the exterior is higher than the interior, then you would have an incidental basement, which is considered a violation. Um, so yeah, typically if people reach out to FEMA, they will reach out to us to work with a property owner and the community to investigate a violation. Um, and these things, continue to happen quite often, which is why we're here to provide technical support. Um, and so we're able to explain these requirements to property owners. That's pretty common. And so, yeah, it was a non-compliant basement because it was below grade on all four sides, and that's how a basement is defined. And so, similar things to this happen quite frequently, and they would have seen all of this through the information that they provided um, in their application. So this is one way that we become aware of violations is FEMA reaching out to us after denying someone's application. So just a little bit of look into what this is first floor height. It's the height of the building's first lowest floor that's above the adjacent grade. And this is a rating variable for insurance. It's only insurance related, has nothing to do with compliance. Um, yeah. So the higher the first floor height is, the less damage is likely to incur. And so that's just part of what goes into the premium rate. So it's kind of uh, grouped these different diagrams from uh, the elevation certificate. So you can see 1A, 1B, and 3 have been looped together. Um, as slab on grade, and then 5 on its own as like a completely elevated structure. 6 has a partial enclosure underneath it, and then 2A, 2B, and 4 all have basements. And so this is just kind of how they've grouped together for insurance purposes, and you should be able to find this, online easily enough. But yeah, that's kind of how they've approached it. Um, yeah, I don't need to go too far into this, but I think I go into a little bit more in our elevation certificate training, which is available on our site. Just more information. Um, there is a few discounts that people can get based on their foundation types and their first floor height. It's complicated, and it's definitely not like you could really help someone project what their premium would be. They would just need to work with an insurance agent on that. And the community form, um, there's a separate box for a LOMA that's in the floodway. Obviously, no fill in the floodway unless there's going to be a LOMAR, which again, very expensive, larger project typically. Um, Not typical for just regular citizens, but there's a different box for a LOMA in the floodway. Uh, just so you know that. And you can always just download these forms and, just take a look at them. They're pretty simple in that way. Um, so of course, anyone in the floodway, we have that diagonally striped area. Of course, the color scheme might be different whether you're on the National Flood Hazard layer or you've gone through Search All Products or if you've made a map off of our floodplain viewer. That's fine. They're all acceptable. Just definitely do not sign the form where there's fill in the floodway because that's a violation and definitely not allowed. So, and then the payment form, this is how it looks depending on which application. So I mentioned the MT2 that's listed there. Um, it's more expensive to try to do it through postal mail, and they've really tried to encourage the digital submission. Um, and as I mentioned, typically it's going to be the licensed professional that ends up doing the submission, but this is how it looks. Um, Pretty straightforward. And then this is their online submission portal. Um, like I said, I've never used it or needed to use it or make an account, so I just would expect that the whoever certified those elevations would be submitting it. Or maybe a person that's doing their own LOMA out as shown, perhaps. But yeah. Uh yeah, and I'm not sure what the turnaround time is, as I mentioned. Um, so they do have some warnings as far as like criminal behavior by providing false information, and we've had, very few instances of this. We did have a surveyor that kind of falsified some information to try to help a property owner, but that is a crime. So, um, just being aware of that. If you knowingly submit incorrect information, whoops, whoa, sorry. I'm using the mouse to move through slides because it wouldn't let me use the button. Anyways, yeah, it's a crime to lie to the federal government, of course. So, um, more information. There is, I think this is up, a letter of map amendment and, revision based on fill class available. So IS independent study. So if you look at FEMA's independent training website, you can find this class. I think it is up. Some classes were taken down for a while and then put back up, but it's about a 2-hour class. You just register for a student ID and then you can start taking them. They do have credit available, just not like a lot of continuing education credit, but that is part of it. You get a certificate. When people are asking where to find a surveyor, we send them to the Kansas Society of Land Surveyors. It just gives them a list of, licensed surveyors in their area that they can then, talk to about, um, getting a survey for their application. And then the MT1 instructions, there's pretty detailed instructions for the MT1 form, and I think most questions that you'd have are covered in that. And they go with the form. They're right next to where you download the form, so I would definitely recommend looking at those because they're very helpful for those types of questions. And then, of course, we are here. There is information online. I'm not entirely sure what's available at this point. Like I said, been a lot of change, especially in FEMA. So I would just, search for whatever you're looking for. But of course, the Map Service Center, that's still available. I don't know if the FEMA library is still, at that address, but they do have a lot of those publications, as do we. So, like looking at the Technical Bulletin 10 for building on fill and those kinds of things. I think floodsmart.gov is still good. And of course, if you ever need anything, you can reach out to us. And then we'll do the second poll question. Um, if you wanted to launch that, Keegan, and of course, you do need to just submit an answer. It doesn't have to be correct, but I need you to participate in that if you want the credit. And then I think that'll be our last poll, and then we can wrap up.
Sorry, I'm having trouble
Oh,
getting the polls to come up. Which of the ones did you want up now?
the first one was the MTEZ, and then I forget what the second one was. And then our last poll is just whether or not you want a certificate.
Okay, so you'd like that one.
Um, okay, we can do this first. I would. No,
I could do the other one, sorry.
it's okay. Sorry. Um, and then you'll see here in our contacts, I don't have Keegan listed, but she's here with us, of course. And then Annabelle Mortimer is our new NFIP specialist. So she's been helping me out and learning new floodplain things. I'm sure she's going to be a good resource in the future. And then if you have any questions about state floodplain fill permits, Janelle Phillips is our stream obstructions person. And so she works on those types of projects on stream obstruction and floodplain fill. I think I'm gonna stop. Oops.
It looks like we've
So,
got about 14 of 22 if you'd like this one to end or if you'd like to keep it up a bit longer.
gosh. Did I stop sharing? I can't even tell.
Yes, you stop sharing.
Okay. All right. Yeah, I'm sorry for all the technical difficulties on this one. Sorry, did you end the poll? Okay. And did you launch the other one yet?
I can.
Okay.
Oh, hold on, I have to stop sharing. Sorry about that.
That's okay. There we go. So yeah, if you'd like a certificate, please answer this one. The community acknowledgement form ensures which of the following: compliance with the ESA, that new development will be compliant with the current regulations, and that no fill has been placed in the floodway, or bottom, all of the above. And then the chat. Um, I didn't see anything in the chat. Okay, I see your message, Sam. That's okay. I'll make a note of that. Okay. All right. Well, other than that, did anyone have any questions? If you wanted to come off mute, you're more than welcome to. Of course, if you think of anything, shoot me an email. But other than that, I will send out a follow-up survey so that we can try to improve our training. And then probably include some of those resources that I mentioned, and then I should be able to get certificates out, I think, later this week. All right, well, if no one has anything else, I appreciate it. Hope you have a great rest of your day.